Hi. Okay, first of all, before I begin, I have a couple of things I want to say. One is I'm going to be reading my story. I've been doing this for years, and I've never been able to do it without reading it, and I finally gave up trying. The other thing I want to tell you, I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. I will be telling you about the murder of my mother's entire family and my father, in the Holocaust. But I'm also going to be telling you a lot about my life after the Holocaust. Because in addition to the chaos that I experienced in my relationship with my mother, Hashem had other plans to test me and to test my husband together, and there was a lot of chaos in our lives. And I don't like to look up as I get into that and see faces of people going, why is she telling us this? I'm telling you there's a point, and you will know what the point is when I get to the end. My story spans over 80 years. It's about the murder of my mother's entire family. And it's about the complete destruction of her ability to function as a nurturing parent for the rest of her life. She was the person responsible for teaching me how to navigate life's challenges, and she failed. My life was a chaotic mess for many decades, and that's an important part of my story. I never knew what my mother was like before the war. Everyone who knew her from childhood was gone before I reached the age of 1. There was no one left for me to ask by the time I started to search. She lost everyone: my father, her siblings and their children, her parents, grandparents, and on her mother's side, all of her aunts, uncles, and cousins. They were the family who knew her from early childhood, who always lived within walking distance. The family on her father's side lived farther away and were only occasional visitors. So there was no one left for me to ask. Because of her unimaginable losses, my mother fiercely needed to control what was left. She fought against anyone that she perceived was coming between her and me. Over the years, that came to include my husband, my much-needed nurturing mother-in-law, and eventually even my granddaughter. You need to know this before I begin to tell my story, because much of the chaos that ruled my life for decades was the result of that relationship, what I learned and didn't learn, and how I defined myself. But none of that was her fault. She wasn't a bad person. She had no way to do it differently, and I wish I had known that while she was still alive. My story begins in a Nazi ghetto in 1944 Hungary. I was marked for death from the moment of my birth. I was born Erika Hornstein on April 23, 1944, in the unimaginable Hungary ghetto. 2 weeks later, all of the women and children in my family were transported to Auschwitz to be murdered. Before I go further, does everybody have a brochure? Yeah, I'm sorry. The reason I want everyone to have one of my brochures is that on the cover there are pictures of all the members of my family. And as was said in my introduction, I want you to look at those pictures because those were people that were murdered. Much of my life was ruled by my role as the child of a survivor. My mother was born in the town of Hajdú-Shamshin. Her parents were Honey Wertheimer and David Petrover. She had 2 sisters, Margit and Olga. She also had 2 brothers, Avram and Yenu. In 1938, when my mother was just 16 years old, the Hungarian government passed laws restricting Jewish participation in day-to-day life. Jews were forbidden to participate in most professions. Jewish children weren't allowed to attend public schools. Jews were forced to abandon their homes. My mother's family was forced from their home in Heideshamschen and moved to the city of Nyíregyháza. Sometime in early 1943, my grandfather's sister Rose began to bombard my grandfather with letters begging him to get the family out of Europe. She lived in New York and had already begun the process of getting everyone to safety. His response was no. He believed the family was safe and that the war would be over long before the Nazis turned their attention to Hungary. My parents had been living in Budapest, and by that time, my father had already been sent to a forced labor camp. Hungary was allied with Nazi Germany, and my mother was alone and very frightened. At first, wives were permitted to visit their husbands, and in the fall of 1943, my mother learned that she was pregnant. She was no longer permitted to visit my father, so she left their Budapest apartment and moved in with her parents in Nyíregyháza. On March 19, 1944, Nazis occupied the town. By April 17th, they had completed the construction of the ghetto. A wall topped with barbed wire encircled the entire Jewish neighborhood. Jews from all the surrounding towns were herded into the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed. I was 1 day old. My grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, so all of my mother's female relatives and their children were moved into the house. There were only 123 houses for over 17,000 Jews, so I can well imagine how many people were in that house. Within a couple of days, my grandfather was dragged from the home and never seen again. Family members in the house included my grandmother, great-grandmother, and 2 aunts. There were also 4 children, me and 3 little cousins, 9-year-old Mickey, 7-year-old Imre, and 2.5-year-old Shiji. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth, he somehow managed to escape from the labor camp and headed straight to Nyíregyháza. The Nazis required that all Jews be imprisoned in a ghetto closest to their official address. My father had papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. The Jews in Budapest had not yet been rounded up, and he knew that he could buy time if he could get us there. I was just a few days old when he arrived. He immediately went to the office of the authorities, which by then was the Arrow Cross, the newly installed ruling party that was more than happy to help the Nazis. My father presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. The details of how he managed to get permission to take us to Budapest were never made clear to me. All I know from what my mother told me is that he received the required permission when I was just over a week old. Knowing that, as an escapee from the labor camp, he was being hunted and afraid to be with us in case he was discovered with us, my father returned to the labor camp immediately after getting us to Budapest. He was murdered on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camp. My mother's 19-year-old sister, Olga, somehow was able to slip out of the ghetto when my father got my mother and me out. She also headed straight to Budapest. When they reached the city, my mother and Olga were able to obtain Christian identity papers, possibly from Raoul Wallenberg, get an apartment, and for a short time, they lived quietly and safely. In early May, everyone who remained in my grandparents' home were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. When the cattle cars were unloaded at Auschwitz, a life or death decision was made immediately by the presiding SS officer. A person's answer to the simple questions, how old, healthy or ill, determined whether you would live or die. The elderly, too young to work or ill, were sent immediately to the gas chamber. If you were clutching a child who was too young to work, you were sent to the gas chamber with the child. No questions were asked. No one grabbed a child away from its mother. That would cause panic, and panic was to be avoided at all costs. By the way, I know that everyone in this room probably knows a lot of what I'm talking about, but I speak in a lot of schools, and this is the one talk I have. My mother's older sister, Margit, and sister-in-law, Clara, were the only ones who survived the initial selections. Jewish prisoners who were forced to help unload the cattle cars tried to save the lives of the young mothers by calmly urging them to hand their children over to elderly people. They tried to save these young mothers from being murdered with their children. At the urging of these prisoners, Margit and Clara handed the 3 children to my grandmother. On that very day, my great-grandmother, grandmother, and 3 little cousins were murdered in the gas chamber. And I can't imagine what my grandmother's last moments must have been like in the gas chamber with her little grandchildren. In Budapest, my mother and her teenage sister Olga were living in relative safety. My mother stayed in the apartment with me while Olga went out for food. On July 5th, 1944, Olga left the apartment. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby Arrow Cross soldiers immediately ran in her direction. Olga turned and ran back into the building with the soldiers close behind. She must have realized that she had very few options, or none at all, that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me hiding in the apartment. So she made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on a Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944, and my mother and I were never discovered. My mother immediately left the apartment and went into hiding. On November 29th, the Nazis completed the construction of the Budapest ghetto. Shortly after that, my mother was caught in a roundup of the Budapest Jews. She was forced, pushing a carriage with me in it, to march in the middle of a broad boulevard to the ghetto. She wore the identifying Jewish star on her coat. She suddenly realized that since she was at the back of the crowd, the Nazis weren't always looking in her direction. There were no Nazis behind her, and occasionally, all of the guards were looking in other directions. She edged her way to the side of the crowd toward the many buildings along the street. Finally, her opportunity presented itself. Seeing that none of the Nazis were looking in her direction and that she was close to an alley between 2 tall buildings, she quickly pushed my carriage into the alley, and no one noticed. She moved to the back of the building, took off her coat, which still had the Jewish star, and discarded it behind a pile of rubbish. After a while, she peered out and to her horror saw that she was less than a block from the entrance to the ghetto. She knew that she would draw attention to herself if she suddenly appeared and headed away from the ghetto, so she devised a daring and very dangerous plan. My mother pushed the carriage directly up to the gate of the ghetto. Hoping that at least one of the guards could speak Hungarian, she shoved my carriage in the direction of the guards and said, "My house is in there, and I was forced to leave quickly so the Jews could move in. I left important papers and I have to go back to see if I can find them. Will you please watch my baby while I go back to my house?" The guards were stunned, but the move was so brazen that they believed her. One of the guards stepped forward, agreed to watch my carriage, and motioned my mother into the ghetto. She walked inside and disappeared down a long street. After a while, she slipped again into an alley and waited for over an hour. She then returned to the gate, angrily told the soldiers that her papers were gone, grabbed the handle of my carriage, and stormed away. She was never again caught in a roundup. It wasn't until after the war that she learned how her older sister Margit died. Clara, her sister-in-law, survived and was with Margit on the day that she was murdered. Margit survived until the very end, working in the kitchens of Auschwitz. On the day of liberation, on the very day that the Allies were entering Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, many of the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from the Allies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margit was murdered on the day of liberation. So that's the story of the murder of my father and of my mother's entire family. However, that's not the end of my story. As I mentioned earlier, my mother was completely destroyed by the murder of everyone she loved. Emotionally, she was an empty shell for the rest of her life. I didn't know what a normal childhood was supposed to look like. I had no idea how my mother's lifelong trauma was affecting me. She was the only adult in my life and needed to have complete control of my world. I knew there was something wrong. I saw how other parents treated their children and how different my life was from other kids, but I had no one to go to for a reality check. For all of my adult life, well into my 50s, I was in constant battle with her. I was trying to break free, and I had no idea how to do it. Sometime after the war ended, Aunt Rose discovered that we had survived. We were living in Budapest. In the chaos of post-war Europe, no one knew who was dead or alive. My mother believed that anyone looking for her would be looking in Budapest. Aunt Rose began the process of getting us to the United States and urged my mother to leave Hungary as soon as possible. She refused. She had to stay in case anyone in her family had survived. It took her over 2 years to accept the fact that she and I were the only survivors. So when I was 3.5, she finally agreed to leave Hungary. But by this time, everything had changed. Hungary was now a communist country, and it was almost impossible to get out. Aunt Rose arranged my mother's marriage to a United States citizen. She could now immigrate. There was just one catch. She couldn't leave Hungary with me. She would have to temporarily leave me behind with a couple she had known for just a short time. She finally agreed to Aunt Rose's plan, married, and left for America. Fortunately, she had appointed an old family friend with good connections as my guardian, because immediately after she left Hungary, this trusted couple disappeared with me. They were unable to have children of their own, and they decided they would keep me. Shortly after arriving in the States, my mother received a telegram from my guardian. It said that the couple had disappeared, and he urged her to stay put and promised that he'd find me. 6 months later, she received a telegram announcing my recovery and that I would soon be on my way to the United States. My mother's marriage was supposed to just get her out of Hungary, but she was alone and easily convinced by her new husband to try to make it a real marriage. And that was a huge mistake. Within a very short time, he became violent. I remember coming home from kindergarten and finding her lying beaten on the living room floor. Shortly after that, we escaped while he was at work. That was the beginning of many disturbing incidents that defined my life for decades. My mother made a lot of bad choices, and because she was always the center of my life, chaos became my comfort zone. And my own issues created a ton of self-inflicted chaos. Our escape from her abusive husband marked the beginning of my journey through 9 different elementary schools. That had a huge impact on my life. I was always the new kid on the block, and I had a very difficult time making friends. When I was 7, she married my stepfather. By the time I was 10, I had 2 new brothers. But my relationship with my stepfather wasn't good. He was just another one of my mother's bad choices, and I was a mess. This is the part where I expect people to kind of like have their eyes roll back in their head, but trust me, there's a point. I didn't know how long I'd live in any one neighborhood, so making friends quickly was a top priority. I developed the habit of lying to make myself stand out, and that backfired many times and always made things worse. My mother's relationship with my stepfather deteriorated rapidly after my brothers were born. I hated being at home, I wanted out, and I needed a Prince Charming. Bill Schwartz was the son of my mother's best friend from our first days in America. I had known him since I was 4 and he was 8. I was just 10 years old when I had my first crush on him. We began dating when I was 16 and married 3 years later, and this year we celebrated our 62nd wedding anniversary. That was the first good choice I made. but it took a long time before any others followed. After getting married and moving out on my own, I thought that I was leaving all my troubles behind. What I didn't know back then is, when you're part of the problem, you take your troubles with you. Nothing about me had changed, and nothing about my mother had changed. In spite of the fact that I was now an adult woman with a husband, she still needed to be the center of my universe. My husband and anyone else in my life had to be a distant second, and I realized I couldn't do it any longer. So after briefly living in the New York area, Bill and I moved to Maryland. But having divorced my stepfather by then, my mother quickly followed. As soon as we bought our first house, she purchased a house a block away. Over the next few years, we adopted 2 baby boys, but even those incredibly blessed events turned out to be filled with their own unique challenges. Both of my sons were born under less than ideal circumstances, and my own lack of parenting skills often made things worse. Our first baby was born to a mother who was on drugs and alcohol throughout her pregnancy, and as a result, he suffered from severe ADHD, and he still struggles with it to this day. Within months after he was placed with us, Bill became critically ill and remained seriously ill for 10 years. Our second baby was born on the Navajo reservation. Before he was placed with us, he spent 3 months in a foster home where he was never held or cuddled. So he suffered from failure to bond syndrome for his entire life. He became a lifelong alcoholic and passed away from liver failure 3 years ago. But in spite of all that, our life in Maryland was about as good as my life had been up to that point. My mother did have a house a block away, but she spent most of her time in an apartment in New Jersey, so that gave us many breaks, and I have many wonderful memories of our early years as parents. Then in 1979, my intense need for family caused us to completely uproot everything. I was very close to my 2 brothers. I had been mini-mom to them from the moment of their birth. They both decided to go to college in California, found the women of their dreams, married, and settled permanently on the West Coast. We missed each other. They campaigned to get us to move west. It was easy to convince me, and I've never had a problem convincing my husband. We sold our home, my mother sold her home, and we all moved to California. Everything fell apart immediately. We were now all together in one place, and my mother needed each one of us to respond to her every need. There were constant battles that started immediately. Bill had walked away from a successful business in Maryland, couldn't get a business going in California, and fell into a deep depression that lasted for years. And worst of all, both of our sons discovered drugs and alcohol right after we arrived in California. My life was falling apart. One of my brothers even moved 350 miles away just a year after we had uprooted everything to move to the West Coast. Our lives were in an uproar, and I spent years having hateful thoughts about everyone. I had nothing and no one to lean on, and tragically, I had absolutely no relationship with Hashem. 8 years after we arrived in California, both of our teenage sons were still heavily into drugs and alcohol. We were doing everything we could think of to get help for them. Nothing was working. Then one day, our 16-year-old son announced that his girlfriend was pregnant. I was at the end of my rope. At first, his girlfriend told us that she was going to put the baby up for adoption, and I was relieved. That was a problem I wouldn't have to deal with. However, after giving in to my son's plea to see the baby, we went to the hospital. After just one look, we fell in love, and to our eternal gratitude, his girlfriend changed her mind and decided to keep the baby. And in just a moment, I'll tell you how that turned out. My days were still filled with rage and depression. The anger and resentment that I had developed for everyone around me was eating me alive. Then one glorious day, I heard someone say these words: "You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your 2 ears." Those were simple words, But something amazing happened to me at that moment. For the first time in my life, I thought, perhaps my happiness or lack of happiness might be a choice. Maybe I can find joy in my day. It was always easy to see only what was bad, but maybe I could seek what was good. I didn't even know if I had the capacity to be happy. I was drowning in depression, and I knew that my life depended on finding a different path. A friend suggested that I start writing a gratitude list every morning. Grateful for what? Grateful to whom? Hashem was still not in my life, but I agreed. There was one shining gem in my life that topped the list every day, and that was the miracle of having Kim, my precious granddaughter, and her mom in our lives. Over the years, her mom had become like a daughter to us, and Kim was the center of our universe. She turned out to be our only grandchild, and we had come so close to never having her in our lives. Another friend suggested that I take long walks and start smelling the roses. I did. I smelled the roses in just about every yard I passed, and I'm sure I looked pretty goofy to my neighbors. I listened to the beautiful sounds of birds. I noticed the amazing clouds. Hashem began to reveal his presence in my life in the most miraculous ways. I started to appreciate all the beauty that he created, and that all helped calm the rage in my head. I had been a screamer my entire life. Like my mother, nothing ever met my expectations, and I knew that I needed to change that. I started the process by giving myself permission to stop yelling in anger the moment I realized that I was out of control. If necessary, I stopped my awful words in mid-sentence. For years, I had felt as if I hated everyone, and I knew that had to change. There were people in my life that I wanted to love. So that became another daily list, reminding myself to seek out every good thing about my family and friends every day. To my astonishment, I realized that I had friends. Still, hateful thoughts popped into my head on a regular basis, and the worst times was when I was driving. So every time I got in the car, I turned on 50s music, my favorite, and sang loudly out loud along. You can't have random thoughts when you're singing out loud. I had been programmed by nurture to see only what was bad in my life, and I was astonished to realize that I had the capacity to see what was good. I had to learn how to tap into that. It took several years for me to overwrite the program in my head, and I clearly remember the day that I realized I was no longer working at it. What I desperately wanted was starting to come naturally. Every relationship in my family changed. The relationship between me and my brothers grew very close. We still, to this day, text good morning to each other every day. My relationship with my mother changed, not because she changed. Sadly, that was never possible for her, but because I learned to set boundaries. So much changed in my head that I became convinced that life would be perfect for the rest of eternity. However, 2 more events proved to me that life is always unpredictable. Our precious granddaughter married a wonderful guy. They had 3 boys and eventually moved within walking distance of our California home. I was on cloud 9, but it didn't last. Several years ago, Kim's husband received a terrific career opportunity in Springfield, Missouri. They moved 1,600 miles away, and although I didn't admit it to them at the time, my world fell apart. But just 3 years later, they convinced Bill and me to move to Springfield, Missouri. They wanted us to live near them. We said yes, and that was the beginning of the happiest years of my life. But the blow we received in 2023 took me back to the brink of despair. Alcoholism finally took our son, Kim's father, and one more time I had to return to daily gratitude lists and long talks with Hashem. I was now a different person, and chaos and depression were no longer my comfort zones. I saw miracles in my life every day. Kim and her family live just 5 minutes from us, and she drives me to a lot of my speaking engagements. She couldn't make it this time, but she usually does. Bill and I have rotating play dates every week with our 3 great-grandsons and a monthly play date with all 5 of them. These wonderful twilight years of my life are happier than I can even describe, and I owe it all to those magic words that I heard so many years ago, and I'm convinced to this day that it was Hashem that made it sink in. So one last reminder, in case anybody here needs to hear it: you may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your 2 ears. And that is the end of my story, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.